of Eagles won the Sidewise Award for Alternate History, and his series of novels set in the same universe, Clash of Eagles, Eagle in Exile, Eagle in Empire, are available from Del Rey. His Roman baseball collaboration with Rick Wilbur, The Wandering Warriors, came out from Wordfire Press in 2020. And Hot Moon, his alternate Apollo thriller set entirely on and around the moon, was launched by Kasich in July 2022. Alan has sold over 40 stories to Asimov's and other magazines and anthologies. His nonfiction essays have appeared in Lightspeed and Journey Planet, and he writes a regular column about scientific and historical turning points for Galaxy's Edge magazine. More info can be had at alansmale.com, or follow him on Facebook or Twitter. Let's please give a generous Charm City Spec welcome to Alan Smale.
Speaking of impacts in space. Okay, speaking of impacts in space. Okay, I think that's going to stay there. We'll find out.
Do you want it raised a little? Do you want it raised a little?
Yes. My reading wasn't actually supposed to be a comedy, but it may work out that way.
Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I'll be here all night, apparently. Okay, so now we're somewhere completely different. We are on the moon. This is Vivian Carter, who is the lead for my novel, Hot Moon, and we're in 1979. As you've heard, I write alternate history. This is my alternate Apollo novel. It was meant as a standalone. It is no longer a standalone, and I can tell you more about that later on. So, 1979, Vivian is the commander of Apollo 32. She believes she's coming to the moon for a 10-day exploratory mission in Marius Hills, which is a volcanic region way back in the past. But things do not go as intended. The Soviets have invaded Afghanistan. There's a very tricky situation going on the Earth. And now we're on the moon. She's just come down from a space station that was orbiting the moon that was actually attacked by Soyuz craft. So she's already seen some action. She's now at Hadley Base, which is the site of where the Apollo 15 landing was in our universe. The Russians obviously have a base as well. That's some considerable distance away. It doesn't feature here. But now, so those of you who've seen me read recently have seen me read a previous section from here where the 18-astronaut Hadley crew, the people who are on the moon, are trying to figure out how they can protect themselves against the attack from the Soviets that they believe is coming. They're a NASA station, they're unarmed, they have nothing there, but they know the Soviets have rocket launchers and all kinds of stuff. And so, in a previous reading, I was talking about how they're trying to MacGyver stuff and figure out what they can use as weapons. This one is a more action-packed scene where things actually happen. Look at that for the time. Hadley Plain, Vivian Carter, December the 9th, 1979. The shriek of a klaxon flooded the confined space of her lunar module, punching Vivian out of a sound sleep. She lunged rightward to where her alarm clock would be on Earth, and her hammock swung left in reaction, almost spilling her out onto Ellis below. He's on the hammock below. Holy shit! She thrust her hands up against the new aluminum siding across the ceiling to stabilize herself. Ellis leaped up, scanned the boards, and then hit comms. Hadley, Apollo 32, a voice overrode him. Buchanan's. Hadley crew to stations. Hostiles incoming. Crews on EVA, move to positions. Those off shift, get up and out. This is not a drill. Vivian jumped down and reached for the liquid-cooled garment she'd wear under her spacesuit. Not yet capable of rational thought, she still knew what stations meant. Ellis pressed the button again. Range and direction of hostiles. Landing 2 miles north, approximately. 3 more questions came in at once. The only one she could disentangle was Gregory Leviton's. Size of force? And it was the only one Buchanan answered. Unknown. Come on, guys, let's talk. More action. We'll tell you more when we can. Okay, so now they're up and out. They're in the rover, racing across the lunar surface. So it's Vivian and her lunar module pilot, Ellis Meyer. Beneath them, their rover bucked, its wheels hopping and bopping over the lunar bumps and rises. Every instant, 2 out of 4 of the wheels were spinning off the ground, while the other 2 bit into the soil to fight for control. Moon dust spat out right, left, and upward. Vivian and Ellis bounced off their seats and clung to the grab bars with their free hands as it surged across the surface. Norton, the commander's voice over the loop. Listen up. 5 to 10 Soviet craft have landed approximately 2 miles north of Hadley. You all know what to do. Anyone who won't be where they're supposed to be 2 minutes from now, report by name only, not location. All others, maintain radio silence. Execute the plan. Ah, the vague joys of non-secure communications. Ellis glanced over to see whether Vivian would respond. 2 minutes. It might be 4 or 5 for them. Whatever, Vivian said nothing. If they were late, no one else could cover for them anyway. They had precious few people to defend such a large area, and everyone else was already moving in different directions. The stresses on the rover reverberated through the chassis and the suit to her spine. They were still almost a mile from the fuel dump, and allegedly 2 miles separated the fuel dump from the Soviets. They'd make it. All of a sudden, Vivian pictured Josh Rawlings, the commander of Columbia Station in orbit, and his crew. None of them deserved to be incarcerated in their own orbiting station, courtesy of the Soviet Unions. And the Reds were coming here now to mess up Hadley and his crew? No freaking way. If it wasn't a sizable boulder or an especially rough crater rim, Vivian Carter was going right over it or through it. Around them, Hadley Base was a hive of activity. 2 astronauts, presumably Leviton and McDowell, were loping at top speed toward the Apollo 29 lunar module, bouncing in high arcs. 3 beefed-up lunar rovers sat outside Habitat A. A driver already sat in the left seat of one, while an astronaut yanked equipment off the back to lighten it. Other astronauts were descending from their LEMs, and 2 more hurried out from Habitat B, clutching a large piece of hardware. Klein and Ibarra and their homemade mortar. Still another rover, already bounded over the surface to defend the newest supply pod. That would be Seaton and Massey, Apollo 30. No sign of Soviets. Nope, must be still unpacking whatever the hell they're bringing. If they'd landed any closer, they could have been easy targets while the US got their attack together. For once, it helped that every extravehicular action on the moon was a complex process. Vivian ploughed her rover to a halt beside the fuel dump, again flinging soil high. Ellis leaped off and kangaroo hopped around the fuel tanks, preparing to deploy the hoses for action. Last resort. If we get so desperate we need to spray the bastards with propellant, we're probably already dead. She turned off the rover drive power and steering, jumped off to eyeball the fuel facility, and headed in toward its now heavily shielded valve system area. Over the last few days, the crews of Apollos 25, 26, and 30 had worked around the clock to fortify those 4 fuel tanks against attack. Using the base's backhoe, plus their rovers and trailers, they carried several tons of lunar regolith across to pile against the tanks, an activity that had the additional advantage of establishing a trench to the east of the base, with only a couple of intact access points. In the moon's low gravity, unencumbered astronauts might drop down into the trench and hop up the other side. Cosmonauts carrying substantial equipment, or say riding their segmented 6-wheeled Lunokhod rovers, might have more difficulty. Except that the Soviets were coming from the north, not the east. Of course. Ready, Ellis? Vivian could hear him puffing with the effort, and Ellis Meyer was a pretty fit guy. Need a hand? No, I'm peachy. He appeared, clutching the huge snake of a fuel hose in both gloves. Here. Vivian stepped up beside him and locked a metal frame around it that would keep it upright against the pressure if they did have to use it as a wacky, toxic fire hose. Gee whiz, remind me whose stupid idea this was? Yours. Oh, right. Norm's voice overrode their channel, terse in their ears. Battle LRVs, go, go, go. Vivian glanced across to Hav A toward the setting sun as the 3 rovers powered up and got into motion. Slowest battle charge ever, though it wouldn't feel so sedate to the guys driving as they swerved around, avoiding obstacles. The rovers now look very different. Originally skeletal and open, thick plates of aluminum shielding now protected the fronts and sides of the vehicles. Their crews might be anonymous in their spacesuits and largely obscured by the shielding, but Vivian knew them to be Norton and Jones and Collier and Lawrence, with Vegas Ember riding the 3rd rover solo. Outside Hab A, she saw Dunlap and Brock setting up their defenses, shielding, a drain pipe cannon, a catapult, and a bunch of rocks and explosive packages of various kinds. Outside Hab B, Dobbs and Vasquez were doing the same thing, and way up front, in a central position, but well away from anything they didn't want to accidentally blow up, were Klein, Ibarra, and their crazy mortar. With luck, That mortar would fling their Molotov cocktails of hypergolic propellants at the enemy and not explode right there in between them. They'd only had time to make a half-dozen shells, so they'd be cautious about firing them. They'd faked up some duds with flares to fire first, to establish range. Also with luck, Vivian and Alice would not be instantly incinerated due to a Soviet rocket igniting the fuel depot they were standing right in front of. Good grief, what are we doing? Apollo 32 should be heading home to Earth by now, basking in the glory of a 10-day scientific mission well done. But no, they were still on the moon. And despite what naysayers like Dunlap might claim, the moon was worth fighting for. Vivian could see them now, the Soviets, racing across the regolith toward her. Racing? Holy crap-holy, said Ryan in her headset. Dirt bikes? Seriously? Nobody else spoke. Nothing else to say because, yes, indeed, the Soviets had bought lunar dirt bikes. The resemblance to a terrestrial bike was strong, with wheels, fenders, seat, and handlebars of similar size. The rear wheels spat up a rooster tail of soil and dust that arced high behind it. Astride each bike was a cosmonaut, his standard orange suit augmented with shiny black shielding on chest, arms, and legs. Even as Vivian ran forward to where they set out the catapult 2 days beforehand, she was figuring the machines out. Battery-driven, must be. So, limited range, just a few kilometers? The tires looked fit and knobby like those on Earth off-road bikes, but had to be solid rubber rather than plated. But rubber would take a ton of damage from the temperature changes. What the hell was the melting point of rubber anyway? Didn't matter. Sorry, motocross cosmonauts, but you're going down. Each rider had a weapon slung over his shoulder, an RPG or a rifle or whatever, but they couldn't shoot them on the move. They'd need to come to a halt to pull the weapons off their shoulders and aim. And that would be when Vivian and Ellis fired at the bastards. 6 bikes spreading out across the landscape and angling back around so they could verge on Hadley in pairs. 2 from the northwest, 2 from the north, 2 from northeast. It wasn't clear whether the riders from the northeast pair had noticed the trench. Its edges were irregular enough, and given the normal scatter of lunar features, that long gash across the soil might go unnoticed. The Soviets obviously had other things to keep their eyes on. Vivian guessed, hoped, that they hadn't expected such a well-organized response. Standard rovers did 12 miles an hour tops. The bikes were surprisingly nimble. 20 miles an hour? 25? Faster than Vivian had seen anything move since she'd arrived on the surface anyway. There's a lunar cart behind the bikes, Jones reported on the open loop. Just one, carrying maybe 3 cosmonauts. Some superstructure. That superstructure is 2 guns in a metal frame, came Carol Massey's voice from a few hundred yards further forward by the supply pods. Guessing SP9s or similar, tripod mounted. Vivian couldn't keep the exasperation from her voice. What the hell's an SPG-9? Buchanan, still in Habitat A, and the only one of them currently able to hold binoculars up, cut in. I confirm, they're a 73mm recoilless gun that fires rocket-assisted projectiles. Oh, for crying out loud. Good job we have rocks to throw at them. They'll need to move in a bit closer first and keep still. Brake, smartasses, said Buchanan. Focus on the bikes, they're the first threat. Then converge on the fricking armoured car. Vivian didn't buy it. Range of SP9? About 800 yards, said Massey. Range of rocket-propelled grenade? 1,000 feet. Perfect. She and Alice would start coming within range of both at the same time, which presumably wasn't an unhappy coincidence. Alice ran around her and they busied themselves setting up his drain pad cannon. Bike on the far left has a rocket launcher, Buchanan reported. Of course it does. With a slight lead on his comrade, the first of the northeastern dirt bikes disappeared into the trench. Discovered the trench. He put the bike into a sidewise skid, but somehow fell into it, dropping down into the trench floor some 4 feet below. Somehow he retained his balance and began driving along it, only visible from the chest up, to bump up the slope at its end point and regain the surface. Astonishingly, his partner managed to leap the trench and keep coming. Damn. But those riders would pass behind Vivian and Ellis, and those from the northwest were angling towards the Hads. It was the 2 that were coming straight towards them from the north that threatened the fuel dump. Even as Vivian realized this, she glimpsed something moving over her and flinched, flinging up her arm to protect herself. But it was several hundred feet up and to her left. A lunar module balanced on a plume of flame, sweeping away to the north. An ungainly flying bird, and swaying back and forth, jutting out white above the head of the insect, were the rounded shoulders and helmet of an astronaut. It was Apollo 31 with Epps at the control, and Flynn literally sticking his neck out. Off to attack the motherships, try and cut the umbilical between the attackers and their exit strategy. Damn, shit was going down. Here goes nothing. Ellis was turning an explosive charge over and over in his gloved hands, looking for his crude priming mechanism. He found it, pulled at it, dropped it gingerly into the tube of his makeshift cannon. As it fired, Vivian saw the briefest of flashes and broadening spherical cloud of dust and gas from the cannon's base. And apart from that, nothing. Ellis, did it go? Yet. Ellis's head turned, tracking it through the air. Vivian hadn't even seen the shell leave the tube, but feared that it might explode right over there and then, spraying them with metal fragments. Steel tube, metal fastenings on the explosive charge, shot right out using a short, intense burst of pure oxygen, which had then ignited briefly in the tube. Jesus, this is much more dangerous than it sounded when we discussed it over cookies and juice. The shell exploded in the air a couple of 100 yards away. A bright flash and shrapnel rained down on the Soviet bikes coming in from the north. Said Ellis. A direct hit on the first try would have been a miracle. But they'd had precious little time to practice, and the targets were moving. At least Ellis had established range. But he had scant time to connect up the oxygen tube, pump up the gun again, and launch another salvo. In planning, they'd assumed the Soviets would be running in on foot, or driving the much more cumbersome Lunokhod rovers. They hadn't reckoned on freaking dirt bikes. The cosmonauts had their legs straight out on either side. They're keeping their bikes upright by skating their boot soles across the lunar surface. It looked dangerous and haphazard, just like the whole Soviet space program, Vivian thought, but it was working. One of the cosmonauts braked, bringing his bike to a skidding halt at the rim of a 20-foot crater 200 feet away from the fuel dump. Clumsily, he tugged on a strap to pull his weapon up over his shoulder. RPG, Ellis called, but Vivian could see that. Rocket-propelled grenade. As she turned, Ellis fired his cannon again. A pyro whiz-bang exploded a few feet to the cosmonaut's right in a bright spray of sparks and soil, but the Soviet was already firing. Vivian saw a flash of fire and an almost simultaneous puff of smoke out the rear of the LPG. The grenade streaked in, arrowing straight for the fuel depot, and with a target that large, there was little chance of a miss. The grenade exploded, another shockingly bright but silent pulse of energy. Vivian relaxed and waited to be incinerated. Thank you. We'll leave it there.
Any lunar questions?
Yeah, how do the dirt bikes compensate for the lack of gravity?
How do they compensate for the lack of gravity? Well, they have 1/6 gravity on the moon, so they're going to bounce a lot. They're going to skate around a lot. They're not going to have as good traction, but nothing has as good traction on the moon. But if they're heavy enough, they can still stay on the surface. It's a little precarious, especially at the speeds they're going. And people do fall off them, but which is why NASA actually had plans to. They did test the idea of taking motorbikes, the equivalent of dirt bikes, up to the moon. They did experiment with them, but decided that they were probably too risky. In my universe, the Soviets have decided they're going to go for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is sort of peripheral to what you were just talking.
Okay.
Peripheral to what you were just talking about, but when you were talking about Soviets on the moon, and we've obviously moved forward in the whole space exploration, I have to wonder, what do you think of For All Mankind, which is, this is the TV show on Apple that is.
Yeah. And I can't decide whether For All Mankind is a good thing or a bad thing for me. It was actually parallel evolution, because I started writing this book. Publishing moves very, very slowly, as probably all of you know. So I actually started writing this in 2017. And when the first episode of For All Mankind aired, I'd already delivered the first draft of the entire novel to my beta readers and my agent. So apparently two different people had the same idea at round about the same time, which is not too surprising because the Apollo 50th anniversary was coming up at the time. There was a little more emphasis on the Apollo program there. And I didn't actually see For All Mankind until recently. I didn't actually start watching it until this summer. Because my agent said, no, you don't want to watch that. Don't worry about it. I'm actually surprised at how little crossover there is. They both start from the same sort of premise, but they take it in completely different directions. There really aren't many scenes or plot points that are similar to the two of them. And For All Mankind, for those of you who've seen it, a lot of it is actually set on the ground during the Apollo era, and mine's set entirely on and around the moon. So they are, in fact, completely different. I now think it's a good thing because I can say, if you like For All Mankind, you might like this as well. So I think it actually works in my favor. We've got our own little alternate Apollo subgenre going here. So I think it's fine.
I have two questions.
Oh, gosh.
One, I can well imagine there's a lot of available documentation of the Apollo program and the plans for what the Apollo program could have been had it continued. Do there exist, and were you able to avail yourself of any documentation of the Soviet sort of presumed lunar missions that might have been in planning phases, or what they might have done later? And the second question I have is, it seems like you have a lot of material to work with here. Is there any chance of a future volume that would extend this story?
Okay, yes, on the Soviet side, the Soviets actually were planning, they did have plans to go to the moon themselves, and they did work really hard on it, and they were dealt a grievous blow by the death of the guy they called their great designer, Korolev, and after that things went seriously south for the Soviet program. But they did actually have a quite detailed plan to go back to the moon with the N1 launcher, and things called LK and LEK landers, which do actually feature in these books. And they're lunar landers that look a little similar to the lens, the American lunar modules, but more curving and bulbous. So there's not as much documentation about those, but those did in fact exist. And I tried very hard in this book to only extrapolate from things that we knew at the time. Documentation for the Earth side was amazing. My previous books were set in ancient North America in the 13th century. And for there, the amount of research, I did a lot of research into anthropological things and stuff like that, but there was a limited amount of period research to do there, lots of other research. But with the Apollo program, there's documentation all over the NASA.gov site, there's lots of books. I was buried in documentation. I've actually read the NASA manual on how spacesuits work, so my spacesuits work right in this book. So I did that so you don't have to. So the little details that I toss in here and there about how far it is to reach to something in the lunar module or something, I tried to keep that as accurate as possible. Because I knew that a lot of people who are also Apollo buffs would be looking at that. So, obviously we're in 1979 here, which didn't happen. We'd stopped going to the moon by that time. But a lot of the things in the book were things that were planned, because they were planning future landings on the moon, and something called the Apollo Applications Program, which was the next generation Apollo stuff, where they would have longer stays and everything. And I tried to stick very close to that, all of those technologies in writing this. Second question about the possibility of a sequel. I actually wrote this as a standalone. This was going to be my love letter to the Apollo program. I was writing it mainly for myself in the first instance in answer to another question. I didn't actually have the audience in mind particularly when I was writing this. And so I did actually write it as a standalone, but the first reviews came in well and the blurbs were good. I have Larry Niven blurb on the front and Robert J. Sawyer blurb on the back, so that doesn't suck. And so the publisher was saying, well, we need another one, we need to, have you thought of making this into a series? And actually, I hadn't at the time. We sold it as a standalone. When my agent was pitching it, she didn't even use those words with series potential, which some people use. So I actually thought about it for a while. The first book is complete to itself. It does not end on a cliffhanger. It's a satisfying read on its own. And it took me a couple of months to think about whether I wanted to do a sequel or not. And I reread the book, and I found several places where there were things that I could have used in more detail, and all this time the writer brain is going, and I'm thinking, yeah, I can see where people would be in 3 years. I can see what would be going on here. I can see what would be going on with these bases. I can see how technology would have improved, how the astronauts would be behaving now. I can see the next generation of this. So yes, I am now writing the second book, which is going to be called Radiant Sky. It'll be coming out in 2024, and it begins 3 years after the end of Hot Moon, with a lot of the same characters.
Alan Smale, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.